Good morning, Ayin Beis, volume 3. We finished the paragraph on page 1293. And as we see, the Rebbe Rashab is now bringing everything together and beginning to understand why all the way back on page 1210, literally at the beginning of volume 3, close to the beginning, he went seemingly digressed into Havaya Merivov, and now he's really tying it all together, understanding this whole picture of how God creates existence, and how through our Avodah and through our journey upward, we transform ourselves and the world around us from a self-absorbed entity into a God-centric reality, where we're completely consumed with a higher presence of God, what is called here B'chol Ma'idecha, in the highest level of it. But you cannot get there without B'chol Avavcha, B'chol Nafshecha, with all your heart and with all your soul. And before that, the Mutva Murgish Muskel, the ladder that we climb from the behavioral and basically from the impulsive and reflexive levels, and then to self-interest, to cognitive awareness of things that are beyond our self-interest, all the way where we transform ourselves from self-absorbed creatures driven by self into being completely absorbed with godliness. And this is now tying together with Havaya Chatem Merivot, which, after explaining the idea that you have the opponents to the divine. And who are those opponents? The Merivov. They are both Gvuris Koshes, difficult and the harsh severities, but also Gvuris of Gedusha, Bnei Elikim, that challenge the chesed and the kindness. And Havaya Chatem Merivov is when we grow to that state where, even though initially Havaya Dezah as a kav, as a structural type of chesed, can be challenged by Gvura. And when is that in the case where the Moichin is more in a diminished role, in a more immature state, Moichin the Katnus, as we explained. So then, however, then comes Rosh Hashanah, when we blow shofar, and we are able to access higher levels of, in the Zah itself grows and becomes a more mature dimension, where it becomes connected with Moichin, and then Primis HaMoichin, Yichud Abba Ve'ima, all the way as it connects to Keser, and from there it draws the power to eliminate the opponent, because it's coming from a higher level. And then there's a higher aliyah, that's the first aliyah of the Gershayim, which is the, what do we call the timing? We said yesterday, they're called with a C. What was it, cantonation? We said cantonation. What do we call the?
Cancellation.
Cancellation. Cantillation of the Gershayim, the two apostrophes that rise upward, and also their sound is a koil that goes gavaya al gavaya, higher and higher. So the two aliyahs, one is of Zah, being Zah of Atzilus, elevating all the way together with Chachma and Bina, Abba Ve'ima, to Keser, and Primis HaKeser, and Primis HaKeser elevating all the way to Lifnei HaTzimtzum, because at the end of the day, the Bnei Elikim are rooted in the Tzimtzum. And since the Tzimtzum has the ability to challenge, the Oyer, like he called the Kav, he called Chesed, the Tzimtzum is the concealment, the Kav is the Gilui. So you need to go Lifnei HaTzimtzum in order to eliminate those challenges as well. So we're talking here, even Tzimtzumim, even Gvuris on the highest levels, which we can't call Gvuris Koshes, because we're not talking here about the Satan or about any the sadism and the cruelty that we talk about on lower levels. Here we're talking about Tzimtzum simply being as a Gvura of a concealment. And therefore, we need to go higher than that to be able to achieve a place where you eliminate the Meriva of the opponent, called the Tzimtzum, which is the root of the Bnei Elikim. Now, I want to elaborate a bit more on the aspect that he spoke about, how the world, we spoke about Bnei Elikim as the root in Tzimtzum edition. So he explained it basically that since Tzimtzum is because it's the level of Gvura, which is the power that conceals and covers up. So it says, we discussed this yesterday at length. So because of a concealment, it leaves some type of residue, has some side effect. And and that side effect is ultimately expressed in toyu, because toyu comes to separate the waste from the dross, or the waste from the nutrients from the fruit. And then through stuta shviras hakelim, what I was troubled by or concerned by, I didn't understand. I still don't understand the flow here. First, he says it has to be pselis from the helam. So there it sounds like that toyu actually is the idea of separating the waste. So first I thought he means that's the whole purpose of toyu, is to separate. But then he says afterwards comes the shattering of the containers, and then the pselis gets mixed with the good. So is he saying that toyu first initially was meant to separate, and then the shviras hakelim, because they were not able to sustain it because the energy was too strong and the kelim were too weak, so it ultimately created the shvira? Not so clear about that. I need to do a little more research of understanding this, the flow here. But regardless, what is clear is the main point is clear, that at some point there is a mix of the two. Like, for example, in this world, it's very clear. Kedusha and Klippa are all mixed together. It's one big, when you have a piece of food, you can use it to indulge in. You can use it to elevate towards Kedusha, to holiness. So we live in a world of jumbled world where pselis, where waste, and where the waste, meaning when I say waste, it means like materialism is an end in itself, and the spirituality that its purpose can all be confused as one big snowball effect. That's why we call it Avodas HaBirurim. The whole Avodah of ours is to separate the two. Lahavdil, ben Shabbos leKodesh, ben Kodesh lechayil, between the holy and the profane. Ben Shabbos, ben Shivos Yemei, ben Sheshis Yemei Ma'aser Yom HaShvi, the 6 days of the work week, and the 7th holy day. We make Havdalah. That's what Havdalah is. Havdalah means birur, separating, and then elevating. Once you separate, you can then elevate the material and elevate it toward the spiritual. So, but that's only possible because there's a whole confusion. How could that have happened? Only because of the concealment. If there was no tzimtzum, it never could have happened. So before the tzimtzum, there's no room for there is no pselis. There's no waste. Everything is purely focused on one thing, divine consciousness. As soon as you create a second consciousness due to the concealment of the divine consciousness, now you have the room for these two different these two forces at work, which ultimately will evolve into Eris and Kalim, and then ultimately really evolve into the divine soul and the animal soul, Kedusha, Kalipa, Zelu Umazeh, Kedusha, and Sitra Achra, all the language that we use about two forces at work, which is the world in which we live. And that's why you need to have birurim. So that's what he says. Now, how do you make the tikkun of tayu? So first the tikkun milmaila, which is not through our Aveda. The Eibishter in tayu, he implanted the power called Shema HaChodosh. Now, this is a theme that was discussed. It was alluded to. He mentioned it earlier on page. Let's find the page. Let me just find it 1 second. It was really discussed at the end of volume 1 in Ayin Beis at length. The Shema HaChodosh. Shema, of course, is ma, bittel. The Shem Yudke Vavke in the language of bittel. Toyu relates to the world of Sag, Samach Gimel. In Ak, you have the Shem Ab, Ayin Beis, 72. So from Shem Ab gives power to the Shem Ma HaChodosh. It's called HaChodosh because it comes after Toyu and after the lower levels. And that Ma, that bittel in Atzilus has the power to correct the disparity created by the shattering of the containers. That's in short what its purpose is. But I just want to find, I think it was here. A minute. Yeah. On page 1272, he brought it like almost halfway down the page. You'll see Inyan Hu Kamoishin is barely ill, and he refers to the Maimarim in volume 1, the end of volume 1. This was a very central component in the theme of Ayin Beis, because the Shema was what connected the Aleph and the Pella, meaning Chochmah to Keser. in the interface between existence and the divine, the theme of Ayin Beis. So Shema played a critical role in understanding how that's done is through the bittul of Chachma, of Tikkun, that counteracts the Yeshus of Toyu that we learned there back in volume 1. And that begins to create the process of interfacing between Chachma and Keser, allowing for the divine to be connected, the transcendent to be connected to the immanent. And he discussed there at length Toyu and Tikkun. I don't want to go over the whole thing because that's so relevant to our discussion here. But since he's referring to it, I just want you to refer. So there he says, so Shema Chodesh comes from the forehead of Ak in the form of the forehead, because the forehead, remember, conceals. The forehead is not like the eyes or the ears or the nose or the mouth. They're open cavities that a channel that's open from the inner to the outer. The Metzach is sealed, but nevertheless, something can be seen on the face when you see the glow on the face. So he calls it b'derech b'kiyah. It's like it breaks through. It's like the example he gives there of the beads of wine on the outside of a wine barrel that's filled with wine inside. So the beads are a result of what's inside. So even though they're only small beads, but they're a reflection of what's going on within. So it's derech b'kiyah. B'kiyah means to break through, to pierce through. Hamshachas atzmi dafke. So there he talks about. Okay, that's where briefly mentioned on page 1272. The relevance to us here is simply this: that this gives the power to create the tikkun. But remember, there is a mix of pselis and this. So then he goes on and says, you clarify, you separate the good, and the ra, the negative gets separate. To the point that this gives us the power that also below there should be a separation of the negative from the positive. So in the beginning of, as it was in the beginning of creation, before they ate from the tree of knowledge. So it was very clear that the klippa was a husk, and it was only a container below the worlds, and there was a separation between that and kedusha, as we learned. The Chet Tzadas caused it to get mixed together again, like in the Shviras HaKelim, V'nisarvu, and that's why they had to go out and work the field, work the ground, work the earth. That's the birurim, which is the work we do till this day. So based on all this, we see that due to the tzimtzum, it created this jumbling or this chaos of the mixing of the two, and that's why you can have ultimately the Bnei Elikim that come from the tzimtzum Arishan who challenge Chesed. They challenge the Gili Hakav. That's because they have that power. Because from the tzimtzum came the ability for this pselis and this waste. And that's why you need Amshacha from Chinas Atzmus Ein Sof before the tzimtzum to completely eliminate all these prosecutors and prosecuting forces and voices and the complainers and all the kitrugim, mekatrigim, those that issue these complaints, the complainers or the prosecutors. Okay, that's what we learned yesterday. It was very dense and brief. That's why I wanted to elaborate a bit more. I did explain it more yesterday at length. But if anybody wants to ask anything on this, please do, because now he's going to continue to talk about what are these two aliyahs in the Gershayim, the aliyah from Zah to Keser, and from Keser to Lifnei Tzimtzum. So it's all coming together now, everything we've learned about before. Anyone want to ask anything? Okay. So let's continue. Ubederech klal. So middle of page 1293, the new paragraph, pages can be found at ayinbeis.com. Ubederech klal, beis aliyas hanal. These two elevations, what we call the two of the Gershayim. The first, from Zoh to Primus HaKeser. They spoke about the bottom of last page, 1292. Zoh, b'chinas arik v'atik b'chinas Primus HaKeser. And the second one that he spoke about from the Maimer v'Nigdashti, the beer of Nigdashti, that it goes all the way up from Keser to Atik to Ein Sof HaMaitzil, all the way up to the place where it gives the power to do something new. Yeah. So Primus HaKeser is Eila b'chinas Atzmus. And so these two aliyahs, Aliyah Aleph, Usha Havaya de Latata, Eila b'Shem Havaya de La'ela. Now he's reintroducing these two names of Havaya, which he did bring on page 1210, which is why I summed it up yesterday. So what does he say? The first aliyah, Shem Havaya de Latata, is Havaya within Zoh, elevating to Havaya La'ela, which is higher than Zoh, all the way up to Primus HaKeser. And now he's saying, who's Shem Havaya the mitzvah shen is bar La'el. And this Havaya de La'ela is mitzvah. Remember mitzvah? The mitzvah is teluya is b'Havaya. The mitzvahs are dependent on, they hang on, they're connected to Havaya. And the very word mitzvah is Havaya. The Yud K Vav K, the Yud K is replaced by the Mem Tzadik. And because the Mem Tzadik, b'chilufim ad bash, the exchange of the letters, Mem replaces the Yud and the Tzadik replaces the Hey. The last two letters of mitzvah is Vav K, as we discussed at length. So it's Yud K in a form of Islapshus, correct? It comes into the Mem Tzadik, but it is Yud K Vav K. And which level? Shmoi, Shem Havaya de La'ela. Sharia mitzvahs say in Rotzna Elyon, because the mitzvahs are the supernal desire, it's God's will. Vu inya Shem Havaya de La'ela. That's the name Shem Havaya, not how Havaya manifests in existence, but how Havaya is Shem Havaya Sheberotzen. What Shem Havaya Sheberotzen? Keser. Keser is Rotzen. Zoh is already how the divine manifests Chesed and Gvura, like he's sitting in judgment, and there could be Chesed, which is merit, Chus, or it can go guilty, Gvura, Din. That's how Havaya is in Zoh. Havaya Ish Melchama. There's a battle. That's how Havaya manifests there. But Havaya of mitzvahs is Ratzon Elyon. There's no battle. That's Shem Havaya, as it is in Keser, or what he calls now Shem Havaya de Le'ela, Shem Havaya Sheberotzen. Okay. Ubesharshe. Now he's saying even this also has a root before the Tzimtzum. And in its root, we learned, remember we learned Hoya Hu Shmei Bilvad, we learned that Hu is higher than mitzvahs. Hu is the neshama. And that's what we mamshech through B'chol Ma'idecha, the Helam Atzmi. Shmoi, Shem Havaya is mitzvahs. So we learned the B'sharshe Be'edein Sof Shalifnei Tzimtzum, and its root in the divine infinite energy before the Tzimtzum, Hu B'bchinas Pnimius Ha'er Shekedem Alei Saratzim. Is the Pnimius Ha'er is mitzvahs that prior to the Alei Saratzim, but it's still not the level of Hu, as we learned. Is the level Kedem Alei Saratzim, so it didn't actually manifest in a desire yet, but it will. And that's what we discussed earlier in the highest level of where mitzvahs are rooted. Take you back to, where was that discussed? Let's find the page where he said that explicitly. Page 1285. Like he says in the beginning of the paragraph, he says, the Ratzon for the worlds comes from Ispashus Bechinas Alesa Ratzon. That's where God has arisen in his desire that he wants to create existence. So it's still the divine as it relates to existence, but there's something that's already Alesa Ratzon. Which is primarily the Yud K, but it's still Gili. It's not Helam, as we discussed at length. So this is the root of mitzvahs. Back to page 1293. Like it says in Tere'er, the Maimon Titzava, Vasisut Tzitz, that make a tzitz, a headband that was made for the Kohen Gadol. Be'inyan, Kodesh, Lamed Lamata. So there he talks about that the way the tzitz was made, there's a Lamed, the letter Lamed. I'm trying to remember the Lamed Lamata, the Lamed Lamaila. But anyway, the topic there is that's where he talks about that the mitzvos are rooted in primus shekedem alei sarotzen. I have to look up exactly what he says there, but he talks about the lamed lamata. There's two orders there, lamed lamata and the lamed lamaila, if I recall correctly. Now, commotion is barley ill, and as was explained earlier, the mitzvos ikram b'bchinas yutke, the page I just referred you, 1285. That the mitzvos is primarily Yudke, the Shem Havaya Sheba Atzmus. Shem Havaya and Atzmus, he means Atzmus here, Etzema Oir, not Atzmus, but it's still lower than the Helama Atzmi. It's still in the Geder of Gilui, as discussed back there, page 1285. That's the first Aliyah. So the first Aliyah is from Shem Havaya de Latata in Zoh to Shem Havaya de La'ela in the level of mitzvahs, which is Ratzin in Kesser, and before the Tzimtzum, Koydem Alesa Ratzin, what he just said now in this the Shem Havaya that is before the Tzimtzum. What's that? Lyre Beis. And the second Aliyah, he bebchinas Atzmus ein Sovev shalamayla gam bebchinas Shem Havaya de Leila. The second Aliyah is going even higher than the mitzvahs, higher than the Shem Havaya de Leila too. So the first one goes from the Shem Havaya de Latata to Shem Havaya de Leila, but it's still Shem Havaya. It's still a name. It's still a form of revelation. Something of expression is there, even if it's an expression to himself. Now we're talking about the second Aliyah, is where we said that Pnimius HaKesser goes to Atzmus Ein Sof, which is even higher Shem Havaya de Leila, which earlier he called Hu, or Helama Atzmi, or Shmoya Atzmi, all the way to the Yechelis Atzmus, if you recall. That's the second Aliyah, which takes us all the way back to the higher level, and both are hinted to in the Gershayim on Havaya Yechata Meriva. And now he's going to connect it to what we learned on page 1210. If you remember there, he asked the question, he said, how could you have the solution, the victory, over the battle from the same level where the battle is taking place? Since Havaya Yechata Meriva means Havaya Ish Milchama, Havaya is engaged in a battle, we see the Bnei Elikim can challenge Havaya. Bnei Elikim, the Isyatzav al Havaya, they stand up and oppose. They say no. Judgment is opposing the Havaya of Zah, which is Chesed. So that Havaya is engaged in a battle. So he asked the question, how is it possible then, Havaya Yechata Meriva, that where do we get then the elimination of this opponent? So he said, you have to say there's a higher level of Havaya, Havaya de Le'ela. And that's where that comes from. A higher power, like we've been learning till now, that transcends this battle. Because at the end of the day, you can say which one is right. Sometimes this one wins, sometimes that one wins. Why Taka on Rosh Hashanah, who says maybe the Katrigim, the prosecutor, has a good case against the Jewish people, who says that we will prevail. And yet we do prevail. Because we're invoking a higher level of Gilui that goes all the way to Keser, all the way to Atzmus Ein Sof before the Tzimtzum. That, like we said, less smaller Bahayatik, it's higher than the whole concept of judgment altogether, and Chesed as a kav, as a structure. So now, and then he said, and that's why we say, on page 1210, he said, that's why we say, Li Yitzchak, that this will be revealed in the future. That's why we say Yitzchak Ata Avinu, and he said Yitzchak is gematria 8 times Havaya. And that refers to the kinner, the harp or the lyre of 8 strings. Yaakov is 7 times Havaya, which is the lyre or the harp of 6 strings, of 7 strings, like he explained there. So there's the Havaya of Seder Ishtalshlus, and by Mashiach will be Havaya de Le'ela, which is the true power of Havaya Yechata Meriva. This is all on bottom of page 1210. So now he's going to connect it back here He's going to reintroduce that. And he says like this, that this higher level, these two aliyahs, this is like the difference between the kinner, ben kinner the Yemesa Mashiach, between the kinner, the lyre of the days of Mashiach, the Shela Osid, and the kinner that will be in the future. That means even later than Mesa Mashiach. So before we learn there's a kinner Bizman Hazeh, there's really three. One is of 7 strings, one is 8 strings, and one is even higher than that. So back on page 1210, I think he only brought the first two, the 7 and 8. Yeah. Now he's saying there's a higher one. So he's going to say, the kinner of La'asid compared to the kinner Mashiach. The kinner shall Yemesa Mashiach, the lyre of Yemesa Mashiach, days of Mashiach, years shall Shmeina Nimen, will be one of 6 strings. Like we say in Tehillim, Lam Natseach al Ashminis, on the 8th. What's the 8th? These 8 strings, the 8th level. V'yadua, and it's known Shazel Ches Pomim Havaya. This is 8 times Havaya, 8 times 26 is the 8 strings, are the 8 times 26 Havaya behind Shem Havaya de Le'ela, which is referring to the higher Shem Havaya. That's higher than the one of 7. Like it says elsewhere, and was explained earlier on page 1210 that I just referred to. And this is the elevation, Sovev Kalamin. We're moving from the imminence of Mamala Kalamin to a state of transcendence of Sovev Kalam. That's the revelation that will be when Mashiach comes. Sovev Kalamin. So 7 refers to the structure of existence, 7 days a week. 8 refers to Shemer Sahekev, which transcends the structure. That's Havaya de Le'ela. So Havaya de Le'tato would be Zah in its regular place before it gets elevated. The first elevation. That would be 7. Elevating Zah to this higher level to Keser, Primis HaKeser. First aliyah is this aliyah to Sovev Kalam. Remember, Keser is a makif, is a transcendent state. He refers us back to volume 2. But I believe he discussed that, right? But now comes a kinner that will be even higher than that. The Medrash says, the same Medrash, that the kinner, the lyre of La'asid. Now, when you speak La'asid, even though Mashiach is also the future, but generally, Yemesa Mashiach and La'asid love are like 2 stages in the future. One is what will be immediately when Mashiach comes, and one will come later, usually Tchias HaMesim, a higher level of elevation in the future itself. So it says the future lyre will be of 10 strings, not 8. Referring to the 10. This is now higher than Sovev Kalam. Sovev Kalam is Keser, or Lifnei Tzimtzum, Kedem Aleis HaRatzon, the previous, the Etzem Ha'er, where mitzvahs reach. Now we're talking about Atzmus saying, Shalamayla b'chinas Sovev Kalam u'Mamala Kalam. This is higher than transcendence. There's immanence, that's Eris and Kalim, the way you mamshach Erin Takeli. There's transcendence that's higher than the Kalim. That's the transcendent state. We just talked about 8. And 10 refers to Atzmus Ein Sof, that's higher than the transcendent and the immanent. And that's what we will reach in the second aliyah, that goes even higher than Havaya de Le'ela. The second aliyah of the Gershayim that leads us all the way to the highest levels. Now, this is all going to become much more clear as we learn later, because how does this, you could ask the question, how does this add to the elimination of the Gvuras, of the judgments? We already eliminated by going to Keser, which less smaller b'hayatika. So what is added by going to the second aliyah? Why do you need the second aliyah? Now, we did understand this because the Bnei Elikim also are rooted in the tzimtzum, so you have to go higher than the tzimtzum. But what really is added here that the first aliyah does not accomplish? So we're going to learn later that there's eliminating the enemies, the opponents, and there's transforming them. So I'm just giving you a little preview of what we're going to be coming to. So we'll be learning that. But meanwhile, right now, he's talking about the second aliyah, which he calls the Lyre of the 10 strings. Any questions? Let me stop here for questions.
Is that second aliyah reaching etzem or yecholas ha'atzmi? Or neither?
Earlier, he used a few expressions. It's the helam of Or, the helam ha'atzmi, the shmoya ha'atzmi, which is yecholas ha'atzmus. Those are the three terms he used when he explained that level of who. That's higher than shmoy. This goes back a few places where he explained it, it spelled it out. But it's definitely not the level of Gilui. We spoke about Etzem Ha'er has two meanings. Etzem HaGilui, that could be Etzem Ha'er. Etzem Ha'er could be Er as it's higher than Gilui, as it's just a divine expression. He used both terms. The real Etzem Ha'er, the real Etzem is the higher one, the Helam Ha'atzmi. But it is a Helam. It doesn't have expression. That's the key point here. It doesn't have any expression even to himself. It's beyond consciousness. That's why you need both, ultimately. I don't remember the exact pages, but if you go back, we definitely talked about this in detail. Page 1285 is one place for sure. I see earlier as well, if I recall correctly. Yeah. Basically, 1280 and on is, well, even earlier. One second. Yeah. By the way, Shema HaChodosh, he also, I see, brings at the bottom of 1279. Just for the record. The first place he spoke about Hu and Shmoi, where was it? Oh. Yeah. Top of page 1270 is also very relevant to this. If you want to know the exact levels of where the Shimu reaches the Sheresh HaKelim higher than the Sheresh HaEdis. Okay. Any other questions? So let's continue. Ubelikuta Teda Pasha Tzav. Alter Rebbe in Likuta Teda the Pasha on Tzav. Ba'abir de'inya Shivas Yimei Miluyim. We explains the Shivas Yimei Miluyim. These are the 3 days of dedication when they dedicated the Mishkan. So 7 days, and then it says Vahi B'Yom Hashmini, and the 8th day. That's why it's Pasha Shmini comes after Tzav. So after they erected, after they put up, they set up the base, the sanctuary. So then there were 7 days of dedication. So he explains there in that Maimer, Shazeu Sha'eser Sfiris Yiu B'Kfiyas B'Malchus. That this level of 10, we speak 7, 8, and 10, he says that that this is the level when you reach 10, that the 10 spheres will be firmly and permanently implanted in Malchus. That will be the revelation in the future. So let me just explain what that means. Remember, and it's also a big part of the whole theme here, just it may, I'm going to say it may complicate matters, but it's necessary. Remember, Malchus is representative of the Levana, of the moon. And the moon is representative of the diminished moon that's weaker than the sun, than Zah. And recall, Malchus has different stages. Initially, Malchus is the lowest of the 10 spheres. Less Lamegar Klum, it has no energy of its own, has no light of its own, like the moon, has no light without the sun. And yet we know Malchus is rooted in Keser Malchus and all the way in the Etzem. So its very concealed state is actually rooted in the highest levels, but it's concealed. So a lot of what our avodas consists of is what we call the binyan hamalchus. That's why we say the 10 days of tshuva, the binyan of malchus. We coronate God as king on Rosh Hashanah, and then we rebuild his kingship. What are we rebuilding? Because malchus on its own is in a state of complete diminishment. And malchus can be complete diminishment. We wanted to rebuild it, that it should be completely revealing godliness. That's why the moon goes through its phases. You have the new moon, which is completely disappears. Right before the new moon, completely disappears. It's reborn, and then it grows. It waxes until the 15th of the month when it becomes full. And then it wanes. So the moon is reflective of the whole Ishtalshlus, especially Yisrael, Damon, the Levana, the Jewish people, that we too wax and wane. There are times when we were at their heights. There are times we were almost extinct, only to be reborn again. We say by Kiddush Levana, Shem Asidim L'Schadish Kamaisa, that the Jewish people who in the future will be renewed like you're renewed. So Binyan HaMalchus, or Tikkun Habgam HaLevana, is another expression in Kabbalah and Chassidus, repairing the wound, the injured moon. You know, when we learn about Tisha B'Av, and we learn about the 15th of Av, so one of the things that Arizal explains, and Chassidus brings the Rebbe with Kavsach Halat in this, he brought this often, that the Arizal asks, why is the 15th of Av, that there's no holidays, what kind of comparison? Yom Kippur, we understand. But 15th of Av, so the Gemara goes into explaining different reasons. But every moon, he says, is full. Every 15th of the month, it's a full moon. What's unique about the 15th of Av? So he says a very strong expression that the Friedrich Rebbe Rasha brings in Eter, in the Maimorim of Echor, Nachemu Eter. A very classic Maimorim that we learn, especially that time of year, that the Yerida, Atzuma, the Begam Alavon, the tremendous Yerida that injured Malchus on Tisha B'Av, which to the point of the destruction of the temple and all the 5 tragic events that happened on Tisha B'Av, he says, L'fi erech Yerida is the Aliyah, because the Yerida was so deep, so dark. That's why the 15th of Av, which comes after such a deep darkness, is greater than all the other Yom Tevim, like the 15th of Nisan, which is Pesach, the 15th of Tishrei, which is Sukkot, because there they didn't have such a Yerida. So in other words, it's the descent of Malchus in its darkest moment that allows it to ultimately lead to the 15th of Av, when you have the ultimate Gili. But this is all temporary. The moon gets full, but then it wanes again. As we learned, there were 7 stages, if you remember, 7 ways of how the Malchus is elevated. Back in the beginning of volume 3, he talked about 7 stages, page 1208 to 1209. And then about Lasid Love, what will happen? He says that the Levana will become as strong as the sun, and in ways even higher than the sun, and it will be mashpia on the sun. Today, Malchus receives Biti, like the daughter. Then it will become like a chosi, like we learned, like an equal, like a sibling, like a sister to Zah. And then it will become Imi, a mother, elevate to the level of Bina and be mashpia into Zah. So basically, Malchus is the place where all this plays itself out in another way. It plays itself out in the Midas, but all specifically in Malchus. So that's why he's saying here that back in Likutei Torah, he explains that this level ultimately, Malchus needs the energies from Zah. It needs the mashpia. So you can have 7, when all the 7 energies are shining into Malchus, but it's not necessarily permanent. Then ultimately, when you'll have the 10, then he says it'll be in an ephron of kvius, that in the future, that Malchus will no longer be diminished. Now it will be permanently have all the 10 spheres will be glowing. Shiur be kvius b'Malchus, in a permanent way in Malchus. So Malchus will have its full glory and many ways even higher because of being mashpia into the rest. He doesn't say that specifically here, but he said it earlier. Like we spoke about the neshama and the guf, that the keli will be mashpia to the earth, the body will sustain the soul. The ayah mashin is barely ill, and delve into what was explained earlier. Dibra mastel v'hoya kisave. In the Maimer Kahaya Kisave, this again is in volume 2. On the bottom, they cite volume 2, page 1128, closer to the end of volume 2. There he talks about Tfilas Ani, but Tfilas Ashir, the prayer of the pauper and the prayer of the wealthy one. So there, I believe he talked about Ani being when Malchus is still in the state of Ani, impoverished, and then becomes Ashir, enriched. And there, and earlier it was explained that this is even higher than Ashir. I have to look up what he means exactly. It could be, Ashir would be 8 maybe, and 10 is even higher than Ashir. Not sure. And where he means Le'el, does he mean probably Chayiki Sove? I'll look that up. I'll let you know what I find. Okay, let's stop again. Any questions? It's very clear he's tying together a lot of themes, many themes that were discussed earlier. This whole context here. So let's continue. V'zeu gamkein, another connection. And this is also remember, when I cited earlier that when Moshe was on the mountain, this is the level he reached. The Eden had built the Chet HaEgel. They sinned at the golden calf. They defied. So there was a very big time of Midas Hadin. You have to destroy these people. Look what they did. They built an idol. 39 days after they heard, don't have other gods. Moshe Rabbeinu had to go up in the mountain, and took 80 days for him to achieve Yom Kippur, the Kapora, Salachti Kidvarecha. So now he's going to bring that into the picture as well, which makes total sense, because that's the place you need to reach to go higher than the battle, because there's a very good legitimate argument of Midas Hadin, of judgment against Chesed. Yes, Chesed is good until they build the golden calf. But now what? So he says, V'zeu gamkein, masher koydem yidgimel midas harachmim, that preceding the 13 attributes of compassion and mercy, which is what Moses invoked, and not evoked, I should say, because the Eibishter revealed to him these 13 attributes when he was on the mountain praying for forgiveness. So before it says, Vayaver, Havaya, Alponov, that God passed through the face of Moshe. Vayikra Havaya Havaya. Says twice the name Havaya. Now there are different ways we count the 13 midas. Some of them count actually Havaya in there. But here he's saying that prior to the Yud Gimel Midas Harachmim, Keil Mole, Keil, and so on, Keil Chanu V'Rachim, and so on, he starts with this introduction, V'yaver Havaya Alpona, Vayikra Havaya Havaya. And he called out Havaya Havaya. So what is this Havara? What is this passing Vayaver? So he says, Havara Zu Ibchinas Aliyah. It's not just passing, it's an Aliyah. It was a state of the divine elevating or to a higher level. The Liyas, being that the Yud Gimel Midas Harachmim, the 13 attributes of compassion or mercy, Hi Amshachim Epnimius HaKeser, is a transmission coming not from Seder Ishtalshlus. It's not coming from the order of the 10 spheres. It's coming from Keser, Pnimius HaKeser. V'Sheirish HaAmshach, and the root of that transmission, Hi Mebchinas Atzmus Ein Sof, Shalamayla Gam B'Shem Havaya de Mitzvos. It's coming from Atzmus Ein Sof that's higher than Havaya of Mitzvahs, because in order to be able to heal, in order to be able to forgive for the transgression of mitzvahs, you have to go to a higher place. That's where tshuva reaches. So you have to go higher than the Havaya de Le'ela of Mitzvos. Shem Havaya de Mitzvos. Ulechein Misham, and that's why from there, Nimshach is drawn Slichas Avenes, the forgiveness of sins, Lias Nesa Oven V'Ever Al Pesha, that he should contain or tolerate the sin, V'Ever Al Pesha, and overlook the crime. Next page, page 1294. As it's known, another subject that he discussed earlier. I see really the Rebbe Rashab is connecting everything. This was discussed in volume 1. So he talked about shemen. So shemen hatev, a very fine oil that when you anoint the king. So he's talking about kishemen hatev hayered ala reish vala zokin, that drips down on the head and on the beard. So we learned about that. That shazel b'chinas pnimius atik. This is the level of pnimius atik from which you need to reach in order to forgive the sins. Now, in order for there to be this transmission from such a high level, that's the vayaver. You need to have the aliyah and Atzmus, the havara, all the way up to that highest level in Atzmus. V'zeu vayaver havaya al ponov, and that means havaya al ponov, beis b'chinas ponim, 2 levels of face, because the first level where he was, and then vayaver havaya al ponov. How do you actually translate that in the verse? Vayaver havaya al ponov. Can someone look at what is the English translation of vayaver havaya al ponov? What is the actual translation? Because he's saying 2 faces, so I'm thinking now.
I'll check it out.
Exact translation. I just want to make sure I understand what he's saying here.
Nothing to do with the reflection of a face to a face that we learned about.
I'm checking. The translation is, and Hashem passed before him and proclaimed, meaning referring to Moshe Rabbeinu.
Say again, read it again. Sorry, I missed it.
And Hashem passed before him, referring to Moshe, and proclaimed. That's it. Hashem passed before his face and claimed.
But Ponav refers to Moshe's face?
Correct. That's the Art Scroll translation. I'll look at the
Okay.
I'll look at the other one.
Yeah, I'm asking because I want to understand the next line. So the next thing he's going to say, actually, we probably should stop here because this is going to the 2 levels of a face. Let's start by Bechinas Atzmus. And then we'll talk about Beis Bechinas Panim. I want to look it up anyway. I'm going to stop on the second line on page 1294. But let's get any questions if anybody wants to ask anything. He's going to talk about the face now. Okay.
I just grabbed the first Seder I had handy, but I'm checking the Kiyos.
Fine. Panov, yeah, but Pasha's Panov means the face of Moshe. That's what I said before.
Yeah.
But I'm trying to see here, because he's referring to 2 faces, Anfer Rabbah, Anfer Zut, the small face, the large face. Yeah, he's going to say basically that the Eibishter elevated to a place that's higher than all the faces. Panov meaning both the face. Okay, so the face of what's the emphasis of that he passed before his face? He wants to explain what the word face means. We're going to learn it tomorrow. We'll learn tomorrow what that means. Okay, I'm going to stop here. And the second line on page 1294.